Welcome to Fearless Security Risk Management. There are some subtleties. I'm Fred Cohen, your presenter today. This is an outline of what we're going to be covering today, and we'll dive right into fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So there's generally a fear of being different in the information protection world. And I think this is also true in the hierarchy of many enterprises and other organizations. The concern is effectively nobody ever got fired by buying. Well, it used to be IBM. At some point, it was AT&T. Whoever it is that you're, not getting fired by buying today. The fear of change, and so there are various aspects of this, particularly in risk management. A lot of people feel they must do a probabilistic risk assessment, and many will call them standards, but they're published lists and other publications assert that some sort of a probabilistic assessment is necessary or reasonable and prudent, and they do so without strong basis. Another one is we have to use a list provided by some standard. So if the standard lists 15 things, we have to use it. And again, that's not really right. In fact, most so-called standards in the security space identify lists of things, and if you read carefully what they say, you might start here, or you have other decisions to make to decide what to do with this, because they don't actually know what the right list is. And then a final one we've seen a fair amount of is somehow you need to compute return on investment, or rather, management may come down and say, I want to know the return on investment for some thing you're trying to ask me to spend money on. And this is a big problem. The big problem is that it's not only unrealistic, nobody actually knows how to do a reasonable job of computing it, as far as I can tell, in the information protection field. In our view, facts bring clarity. So if everyone else is jumping off a bridge, will you? And that's actually a question my mother asked many times when I was young. It's the old lemmings to the sea question. If other people are doing foolish things, will you do the same thing? And the answer in many cases is yeah, sure, because nobody could claim that I'm doing something unusual, or assert that I wasn't diligent by doing what everybody else did. But I think that that's not true. I think you can not be diligent by doing what other people are doing when your circumstance is different. There's this notion of reasonable and prudent, or due diligence, and what that comprises of, people aren't that sure in all cases. There is a substantial legal history behind it, but most people are unaware of that, so they sort of substitute other terms. Turns out probabilistic risk assessment, PRA, does not apply in most cases, and there are good reasons it doesn't apply. Among them, the typical formulation is you need the probability of events for all events, and even figuring out what all events are is something we don't really know how to do. And assessing a probability, we don't have enough historic data from enough places to give us probabilities. But in fact, frequency is a better term of art, because most every sort of attack mechanism that's widely characterized occurs more than once per year for most large organizations. There are various lists that tend to conflate threats and consequences. So they might say the threat is that an insider will break into the vault and steal this money and then resell it on the such and such market, and the valuation will go down. So they're sort of conflating all these different aspects of sequences of events as if they were all the same thing. And they're not. They're different components that we usually use to break things down. As I mentioned, nobody can really accurately compute return on an investment in advance. In fact, just computing the loss, the actual loss from something that already occurred, is typically varies by several orders of magnitude. And that's been true for many years. So if you can't compute the actual effect after the effect, then the notion of predicting the effect in advance seems problematic. And finally, risks are things that we take in order to gain rewards. And so this goes to the issue of the fear of being different. So let's see how different. I wanted to talk for a minute about what we're talking about, the sort of the deep dive on risk management here. And I want to start by talking about what is risk. And and really what's risk, not sort of this commonly accepted view. And so I'm warning you, this is not a commonly accepted view. So uh, I used to teach my kids to predict the future and read minds, and I'd say, what they say, what do you want from me? I said, I want you to predict the future and read minds. And they said, I can't do that. And I said, sure you can. They said, oh, give me an example. I said, okay, the sun will come up tomorrow, and naturally, that's a prediction that those of you that didn't believe I could predict the future now say that's a foolish prediction. That's not really predicting anything, which is to say I'm now reading your mind. So we can predict the future, and we can read minds, and we do this all the time. We just can't necessarily predict all the futures, or read many of the other states of mind, and so forth. So the idea here is that the current view of physics is that it's an infinite dimensional Hilbert space, whatever that is. It's easy enough to look that up on the internet. But I'm going to use this picture here that you see over in this area. And basically what we have here in this picture is the current system situation, characterized to some level of granularity by whatever method we use to characterize it. That's a model of the state space at a given granularity. And as you move forward in time, at some granularity of time that you can distinguish and try to apply, there are various events that are undertaken, activities that take place by both you and others. So there are many parties simultaneously undertaking events. And all of those things that happen change the state of the situation. And as the future moves further forward in time, the situation becomes, more broad in its potential situations. And ultimately, at some future time, there's the set of all anticipatable future situations and a desired subset, which we'll call constraint. So this is model-based situation anticipation and constraint. And the idea is for you to pick moves that constrain the situation per your desires, and everybody else is picking moves to try to constrain the situation per their desires. And they may want to be in what you would call the red, whereas you may be in what you would call here the green or the blue. It's not a very good shade of green. So when you talk about risk and reward, free will from all parties and naturally occurring events, those are causes, act through the mechanisms of the world. We'll identify that as mechanisms M to produce effects E. In this Hilbert space, we form causal, that is cause acting through mechanism produces effect, or statistical models with some set of assumptions to predict or anticipate the future situations. And then we make moves to try to affect or constrain the future. Model-based situation, anticipation, and constraint. A few errors on the slide. So, at a theoretical level, this is marginally interesting to some of you maybe, but I run a business and I take risks to gain rewards. So I don't necessarily do this by creating, various kinds of computational models or something like this, but I think I do something like this in my head all the time. When we do risk assessment for information protection, I do these rapid assessment processes about every 6 months for a variety of entities, including my own. And I do updates on changes, both because of external and internal changes. So if I change something internally, I'll go through and update my assessment. And if there's external changes that mandate, that reach the level of import that warrant reviewing it, I review it. So after the business modeling, which is understanding the situation, which we've discussed in previous webinars, and after the duty to protect analysis, where we identify what our duties are, this also tells us something about the moves available. So we're trying to figure out what we can do and what we can't reasonably do. I assume a design basis threat, which is a set of mechanisms, right? So cause, mechanism, effect. And I do this based on history, research, expertise, and awareness. And today, the design basis threat that I use is, and this is a shortening of the total list of things involved, approximately an insider working with non-physical access at a nation state level of quality. And I assume I will not be able to defend against the physical nation state. So even though, it's a real, maybe for me or maybe not for me, it depends on my situation, realistic to assume nation state level actors, I can't defend against, New Zealand even trying to, send their army against me. I'll just put up my hands and surrender. So I'm not going to be able to defend against the physical threats of a nation state. I think that's the job of the nation state. But against the information-related threats, I may have to. And then normal burglary, competitive intelligence, and including physical intelligence and burglary, with special protection for select clients. So there might be some clients that require something special or different. But that is the design basis threat, the basics of the design basis threat that I use. And I'm trying to take risks to gain rewards. So I deal with the interdependency causal chains. I look up to the national infrastructure level. So I'm concerned about infrastructure failures between me and the global internet. But when it comes to the global internet collapsing, I'm not concerned. I'm worried about power. I have to make sure that I can sustain power outages to the extent that they happen in locations that they don't do great harm to the business. But I also, make choices about, cost and value that I gain for the cost. So I'm not going to pay an extra $1,000 a month for a completely independent, lower bandwidth internet connection on the off chance that my already however many $100 a month internet connection to this location is going to fail, because I don't need that as a critical resource. If the cost is too high, I find another way. I have a cell phone. So my cell phone goes through a different infrastructure than my other internet capability, and I can actually go through my cell phone to reach the internet. And if I really wanted to, I could probably use my cell phone to come in from the internet, but I don't find that there's likely to be any need to do that. The consequences, these effects, I already understand those because I did the business modeling that we discussed previously. I have a tendency not to make bets I can't afford to lose, so I just won't put it enough at risk to do great harm. And I limit the consequences from any one cause or any one threat just by limiting various facets of that. And I can talk about that in the more detailed part of the review that we'll be going into over the coming months. And then finally, I do surety matching. I use methods with surety match to the consequence. So I generally assume the 3-level consequence model that's in the standard of practice, and assume a true redundancy of 3 is safe, except for me. That is to say, if I get hit by a car, if I get struck by lightning, my business is going to end. That's just the nature of my business. But otherwise, I want to make sure that I have at least, I can sustain at least 2 failures of critical components without collapsing the business. And of course, when I look at risk, as I've discussed before, I use the standard of practice for common decisions. So I just run through the 100 or 10 or so standard ones right now. I review them at least annually, review on material changes, and every 6 months for some parts of it. I tend to use this tool decider that's depicted in the upper right-hand corner that I've discussed in previous sessions for things like investments in new businesses or lines of business, or decisions between alternatives for major changes in elements of infrastructure. Now, of course, there are many approaches to risk management, and but I have found that continuing to get more and more information doesn't continue to help after a certain point. You just get overrun with lots of minutiae and facts that are not necessarily relevant, or where you don't learn much more. So the real key is finding the right information. And of course, there's only one way to evaluate whether you've found and used the right information, and that's after the fact. And then you're not even sure. But we can try to anticipate and constrain at some level of effort and cost. So that's sort of the minutia of what I do. And now I want to talk about how Fearless does this as an approach, and the fields of at issue here in the risk management space of the larger picture are the assessment, interdependency analysis, consequence, surety matching, and making choices. And then we'll be following this by a discussion where we'll turn off the recording. So we apply our standard of practice. It's not a standard. That is, it's not something you just follow. It's a baseline of practice. That is something you do. And I just want to point out it's open source. You go to all.net. I'll take you there now. You go to all.net. You click on protection, and you see, for example, under enterprise protection, the standard of practice, and that appears down in the lower part of the screen. And you can go through all the elements and see what they are. We talked about business modeling. We're in risk management here, so we're going to talk about risk definitions and how you define the levels of risk and so forth. So it's all open and out there. Anybody can look at it, and we've had it reviewed by many people, and we certainly welcome your review or the review of anybody else that's interested in opining upon it. The key, of course, is, we use that to help our experts. And if you're going to use it, you should use it to help your experts. It helps ask a reasonably comprehensive set of questions, codify responses consistently in a defined language, so we're not arguing over terms. Try to guide decisions using a predefined basis, but the predefined basis isn't always right. So we try to identify variances from the baselines. And so if we find things are different than what we normally see, we say, scratch our heads and try and figure it out. And now what happens here is when the practice works, we use it. When the standard of practice works, we use it. But if we find variances that are sort of rare, bizarre exceptions for some particular situation, we don't update the standard of practice. But when we find things that are broadly used and that could apply elsewhere, we update the standard of practice. And we've done this for many years, which is why it has evolved into what it is. Drilling down into the process selection element of risk management, this has to do with what process we use to do assessment. And I just want to note the protection posture assessments are lightweight initial and periodic reassessments every 6 months in the middle here in that yellow area. That's what we use, the lightweight initial and periodic. And I generally say if you don't know what to do, start in the middle. This takes the parameters are threat level, low, medium, and high, whatever that is, low and medium and high consequence. Those are defined elsewhere, and we'll get to them at some point. But if you want to see, the description of the decisions we made in this regard, you should go revisit our webinar from the Fearless Security Briefings. And the rest of the discussion here is going to discuss things that we talked about in these other webinars at a less detailed level. So you should go look at those decisions, and I'll have some slides that include those. But basically, unless you're in a high-risk situation up in this area up here, you're going to want to start in the middle. Or maybe if you're just some small office and there's really nothing important that can happen and so forth, you might want to start in the low threat, low consequence region or something like that. But we advise to start in the middle because when you start in the middle, you'll certainly identify where you are in this picture. And if there are particular areas where you need to move up, you can do that. But if you don't do that, if you just start sort of in the lower left, assuming you're low threat and low consequence, you may just end up never finding out the reality. Interdependency analysis, you might recall from our previous briefing, I have the slide up here in the upper right-hand corner. We talk about business utility. Everything's about the use that we're going to make of it in our approach. So, we use these remote sessions for giving presentations, but we also use them to collect information from clients for some of the assessment processes using the standard of practice. So that also depends on people who depend on content, depends on systems, information infrastructure, physical infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and so forth. So that's what we mean by the interdependency analysis. And we go through this exercise, like I say, once every 6 months, although what you'll see in almost all cases, when you get about to this level, things don't tend to change very much over time. I mean, maybe if we're making a decision to change the major part of our information infrastructure, they'll change. But otherwise, this is going to stay the same. Unless you're changing the systems you're running on, that'll stay the same. The content does change much more often, and the people we depend on, they change fairly rarely. So in our particular business, there's not a lot of change here. But in a large enterprise, there's a lot of change in people, a lot of change in content, a substantial rate of change in systems, some but less change in information infrastructure, physical, unless there's a move or something. And critical infrastructure tends to not change rapidly over time. It breaks in known ways. So to understand the potential failure modes of a system, you have to understand that whole dependency chain and then compensate for possible failures to the extent that there are things you deem worthy of consideration for your risk management. And if you want a lot more detail on this, what you do is you take this here, site all.net interdependencies. You go to Google and you put that in as the search terms. And here's what you'll get from all.net. Plenty of articles on different aspects, parts of books, and so forth. So as an approach, if you just put in that search term, you'll get a lot of information on these interdependencies, and you'll get a good sense of what that's about and more specifics. So that's sort of the deepest drill down that is readily available. Next focal area here is consequences and surety matching. again, the fearless briefing from December 16th, and we talked about what could go wrong, right? So when you're understanding the business model, the questions you ask are what could go wrong. What happens if we lose integrity and availability? That is, what promises that we made can no longer be fulfilled, and what are the consequences? So surety matching is the notion that once you understand, for example, loss of integrity or availability could cause promises with regard to competent expertise, resulting in slight embarrassment and cost, need to re-enter information and such. Low consequence, short time frames. Okay, so that's not high consequence or medium consequence. That's low consequence. So probably you need some, you don't need high surety to match that. There's the question of how many surety levels you want and what they are, and why do I think that that's the case, and so forth. And then if that is the case, why measure more? And so generally, if you look at the standard of practice, and I'll go back to it with regard to surety levels. Let's see. Again, from the same place we were before, you look at process definition. How are they defined? This is the definitional question. And the decision in this regard, there's the basis as you analyze it in these various terms it describes it. The decision is basically that unless you have some continuous measurement process in place, you should be using the 3 level. And the real reason is that you only have typically 3 different classes of alternatives with regard to risk in terms of protective measures you can take. So if you had 50 different levels of protection that you could afford, or a continuous dial, you might want to measure risk to or consequence to a higher level of granularity. The 4 levels not bad, also, especially for things where people can get hurt, or large numbers of people can get hurt. But for the most part, the 3 or the 4 level are adequate to differentiating, from a decision-making standpoint, the available alternatives. So it just wastes time and effort and money to go to 6 digits of accuracy when you only have 4 alternatives. So that's the reason and the underlying basis for that matching. And in any case, this making of choices, that's what the standard of practice is about, right? You have the finite set of alternatives, the methodology for making the choices, but it shouldn't be treated as rote. It's not something where you just go through and do it. Although for testing purposes, we are effectively doing that with some minor variations for testing the new standard of practice for archives and records management against the current records management and archives industry and practices around the world. It's a process by which experts make judgments using the standard of practice to decide whether their judgment is sort of common and reasonable and prudent and based on something, or whether there's something else involved that we were missing. But the ultimate decision maker is not the standard of practice, because risk management is part of management. That is to say, executives make decisions. If they decide out of ignorance, I think they're likely to do worse. In many cases, the person doing this analysis is not the decision maker. So, I've gotten used to this as an employee in other businesses and as a consultant. It's not your decision. All you can do is inform. So the idea of getting stressed and being afraid of all this, if it's your decision, it's your decision. If it's not, it's not. The standard of practice can help you inform, but ultimately, whoever the decision maker is has to decide. So how does this remove the fear? Well, one of the things that causes fear is a lack of knowledge or the ability to apply it. Obviously, nobody knows everything, especially in information protection. It's such a broad and sweeping field. But even if you did, suppose you know everything, probably you can't reliably apply it on your own to any substantial enterprise, because there's other people involved. And even if you could, I couldn't, because I'm not you. So if one person could somehow magically do this, it wouldn't solve the problem, because we have a world full of people. So another thing is that being reasonable and prudent doesn't mean being perfect. So this notion that if I made a mistake, the world's going to end or something, it's really not true. And to the extent that situation does arise, then it's not one person's fault. It's a whole lot of people not doing the job right. But what it does mean, being reasonable and prudent, means reviewing the issues and making decisions, and doing it with a reason, with a basis, and a documented basis is more desirable. means being reasonably comprehensive in your coverage. So, you're not missing big things that happen very often, especially in your trade or organization. And it also means tracking the world and your business for change. So as things change, you have to compensate for the change. You can't just, sit there with a static view of the world, ignoring what's going on around you. The standard of practice is one path to doing this, but there are certainly others. But I think, by following the standard of practice, we know what we're deciding to risk and why we're deciding to risk it. How do you carry this program out? That's another good question, but it's a good question for next month, where our webinar is going to talk about control, influence, and feedback, which is to say governance. I'm going to turn off the recording now, and we'll go to Q&A.